afternoon, my name is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History, and we're going to bring you part 2 of the story of William Driver from Salem, Massachusetts, and it's also the story of Old Glory, our American flag. And there's the first picture there, and there's a picture of William Driver, and it's a story that a lot of New Englanders are not aware of, and probably every American should enjoy watching this. So we'll go to the next slide. And from our first episode, we left coming out of Tahiti. We had the Bounty. This is 37 years before William Driver got involved, but it's part of our history story. And they had a mutiny on it. And it was interesting because they went 1,000 miles west of Tahiti. And then they finally had it with Captain Bligh, who was very, very cruel. And so half the crew mutinied, and the other half they set adrift on what they call a longboat or a launch. You can see that in the picture there. Fletcher Christian was took command of the Bounty, and he sent Captain Bligh off. He sent him adrift. In terms of location, they were 1,000 miles from the nearest island of Tahiti, and 3,000 miles from the next nearest island, New Zealand. So they were just set adrift in the Pacific Ocean. And we'll go to the next slide. And there's a great painting there. That was it. They had this launch, and it had a small sail on it, middle of the Pacific Ocean. And there's Captain Bligh with 18 of his loyal sailors with him. And the rest were on the Bounty, which is still flying the British flag in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, Captain Bligh, after many, many days at sea, finally found an island that he wasn't aware of, and it's called Tofua Island in the middle of the Pacific. It's a volcanic island. You can see on the left a picture of it. And his men, I mean, they were almost starved. They needed water, they needed provisions, so they thought this was their, that's going to help them out an awful lot. What happened was, you can see in the picture on the right, they got on the beach, and the natives there were completely unfriendly. They went after them with their spears and knives, and they actually stones. They started stoning them. So what happened was they got back on the boat. This was a very unfriendly island, and went back out to sea. But it was interesting because one of his sailors that was killed, that was under Captain Bligh here, he was actually stoned to death by the natives. He was trying to cut the rope where they had their boat somewhat anchored there on shore. He was trying to cut it, and they just surrounded him and they stoned him to death. And his name was John Norton. So I have no idea if I'm ultimately related to him or not, but I'm going to do some extensive genealogy research to find out. We'll go to the next slide. Now, Captain Bligh and 18 crew members, they finally made it to Timor, Indonesia, adrift in the Pacific on their boat. They actually were 3,618 miles distance they had to travel to get here. And took them 47 days, and average of about 77 miles per day. And they sent him off there with no charts, no compass, just a sextant and a navigation book. So it was basically dead reckoning. And because he's such a skillful captain, he survived them, and they made it. And they said that the reason that they really made it was during the whole voyage, it was just about raining every other day, so they actually got fresh water to drink all the way, which was really, really advantageous for them. Now, when he got to the islands, he notified the British authorities of the mutiny on the Bounty, and of course, under British law, high crimes on the sea, if you had a mutiny, all those that were what they call the mutineers were punishable to death by hanging. And that's where our story continues. So we'll go to the next slide. So Fletcher Christian now, he's got the bounty, he turns it around and he says, well, we're going to go back to Tahiti and get provisions. That's a 1,000-mile journey. So there they are in the bounty. They turn around in the opposite direction of Captain Bligh, and they're heading out back to Tahiti to regroup, if you will. Here, we'll go to the next slide. And so now they're approaching Tahiti. This is a excellent shot. You can see the island there pretty much. Topographical information here. Quite the place. That's where they originally were, of course, where they originally stopped. And we'll go to the next slide. And this is a great picture. It shows the bounty with the British flag on it, finally coming back to Tahiti, and all the Polynesians, natives, rowing out to greet them, and they were happy to see them again. It was a great welcome. So we'll go to the next slide. But Fletcher Christian, who now was in charge of the bounty, he knew they couldn't stay there. They stayed there for 5 months, undiscovered, and he knew that if Captain Bligh were ever to have made it back to the British authorities and told them of the mutiny, that the British Navy would send all kinds of ships out to capture the mutineers. And since Tahiti was one of the islands on the main shipping lanes of all these sailing ships that crossed the Pacific Ocean, he had to do something about it. In other words, basically this port here in Tahiti, you were not safe from the British. He had to do something about it. So if we go to the next slide. So all the mutineers left Tahiti to find a safe home. And from the 5 months they were there, they made friends. They had a lot of their girlfriends they had, and they took them with them, Polynesian, and they were heading off to find a safe home. This was in 1789, and there's a picture on the right of Fletcher Christian. Now that they're just setting off, he's got a chart, and he's going to try to find an island. He looks at this chart, and he's hoping he can find it before his crew rebels against him. And we'll go to the next slide. And he opens out his chart there, and he discovers this island. And on his chart, they called it Pitcairn Island, but on the British chart, which they had for many years, the island was located 175 miles south of where it should be on the chart. So he figured this is perfect. No one even knows the island is here. We have a good chance of perhaps settling on this island. Let's go for it. And of course, Pitcairn Island now to the east is 1,000 miles east of Tahiti. And we'll go to the next slide. And there it is. It's quite mountainous island. Now they settled here, and very rugged, but they set up farming and to grow crops, and it was when they came here, it was completely uninhabited, so they didn't have to worry about the unfriendly natives. That problem that they had, that Captain Bligh had. And so in 1789, this island was completely uninhabited, and that's where they stayed. And we'll go to the next slide. And this is a great shot. Pitcairn Island. It's 1,000 miles east of Tahiti. It's an uncharted island by the British, and it's 175 miles south from where all the British had on their charts. And even today, it's one of the most remote islands, civilizations in the world. And you can see because of that, it's so far away from everything, and there's no airstrip on it. You can't fly a plane and land it there. That's one thing. You'd have to go from Tahiti and get a boat and travel 1,000 miles just to get to it. It's a great hiding place, if you will. So we'll go to the next slide. And here we are. The Bounty approaches Pitcairn Island. You can see the great painting. You can see how mountainous it is. Here we'll go to the next slide. Now, what they did, they anchored there. No one came out to greet them. And Fletcher Christian said, we're going to completely empty the Bounty. So all the cargo, all the food, whatever they had on there, they just took these several long boats and back to shore, back out to the Bounty, completely emptied the Bounty. And you'll see in the next couple slides what they did here. So we'll go to the next slide. They put it in the center. There's like a bay here right before, right on the outskirts of the shore of Pitcairn Island. They put it out there. And Fletcher Christian said, you know, if we anchor this here, the British would have a chance to stop by the island even inadvertently, and they would see the ship, and they would come here and get us. And the only way we can be completely safe from that is what we're going to do in the next slide. So I'll show you the next slide. So they set the Bounty on fire, completely destroyed it, and it sunk in the bay. This was January 1790. And a whole lot, but now, you know, they came to the realization that they are stuck there on this island. They have no way to get off. You know, sure, the British can't discover them, but now they're stuck here. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's to give you an idea of the type of huts that they made when they settled here. They were undiscovered for 19 years that they stayed on this island, from 1789 to 1808. And 1808 is actually an important part of New England history. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, what they would do is on the side of the island there was a large mountain with a cave on it. You can see that in this picture here. If you look closely in the mouth of the cave, you actually can see some people there. You can see how big this is. But Fletcher Christian, he would have sentries, and they would go up there, and they would look out across the Pacific Ocean with the idea to alert anyone if the British were going to come. And they did this for 19 years. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's a great shot. That picture was taken from inside the cave. And you can see it was quite a you could see miles and miles out and off the coast. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, you're going to wonder, what's Dave talking about the mutiny on the Bounty? How does that connect with William Driver and with New England? Right now, we haven't really said too much about the New Englanders. So the first New England to come into this story is a gentleman by the name of Captain Mayhew Folger. And he was born in Nantucket, which of course is Massachusetts. And in 1808, from Nantucket, everything was whaling. So he set out his whaling ship called the Topaz. Very important history. And there's a picture of what Nantucket looked like, and he was loading up his ship ready to go out on a whaling voyage in the South Pacific. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's a terrific painting right here. Here he is, he's setting sail from Nantucket, heading for the South Pacific. We'll go to the next slide. And of all things, whether it was a storm blew him off course or whatever, he happened to discover this island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There's his ship there. And so he actually anchored there. And of course, after 19 years, the settlers never even saw a ship. So here's a whaling ship from Nantucket, the Topaz. And Captain Folger is getting credit for actually discovering the actual Pitcairn Island, which was amazing. Amazing. He only stayed there, they said, maybe 5 to 10 hours. That was it. And then he went back, of course, and continued on his voyage, and ultimately notified the British of this island so they could change their charts. So he's an important person in history from New England to actually finally chart this island. We'll go to the next slide. Now, when he was there on Pitcairn, he met John Adams, and John Adams was the sole survivor. Remember, this was like 19 years after they settled there, Mutiny on the Bounty. He was a sole survivor, and he was the last surviving mutineer. They all had, one way or another, they died of diseases or died of disputes among each other, fights, things like that. Last surviving mutineer. So when he went to notify the British and rechart the island, he said, I discovered one of the original mutineers. And they were astonished about this whole story with the island. And he convinced the British, look, this gentleman now is in his mid-60s. He convinced them to spare his life. Otherwise, they were going to go out there, stop there, and hang him, which was according to the law of the British Navy. We'll go to the next slide. And there's his grave. It's on Pitcairn Island. And he finally dies a few years later, 1829. He lived for 40 years on the island. Amazing. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, there was, at this time, they had a different, the next generation of islanders, if you will, from the Bounty descendants. There were 65 of them. And in 1830, they couldn't farm there anymore. Everything was they had a drought, they had all kinds of problems, and they were going to eventually die on the island. So they were evacuated from Pitcairn Island to Tahiti in 1830. And there's Tahiti on the right. Here we go, 1,000 miles all the way back to Tahiti. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, Captain Driver comes in. He's the second naval officer. Set sail from Salem, Massachusetts to Tahiti in 1830. And we'll go to the next slide. And his first stop from Salem is the Caribbean Islands. And that's quite a nice picture right there. Of course, he's making all his regular stops. He's a merchant sailor, if you will. We'll go to the next slide. And I've had to do some research to find out what exactly was he a merchant. What were the goods he had? And on Tahiti, the big industry there in the rest of the world was what they call the tortoiseshell trade. And they would fill their ships up with tortoiseshells, and they were ultimately going to stop at different parts of the world. And you can see in the bottom right, they use, women use those for knitting needles. They use them decorative casings and decorative, all kinds of things like that. That was really, really in demand across the world back around the 1830s. That was very, very profitable. So we'll go to the next slide. And now, once again, he's got to navigate. Remember, he's already got, previous episode where I told you how he used to take his ship, the Charles Doggett, he would take his ship around the world twice, and here he goes again, a third time. He hits a sea storm around Cape Horn, South America, which is the most treacherous place to navigate a sailing ship in the world. The Pacific Ocean crashes into the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see that's a great picture of the rough seas. He just about made it there. They just got pounded by a storm. And we'll go to the next slide. Now he stops at Tahiti, all right? So now we had we had the other fella, Captain Folger, who stopped at Pitcairn Island from Nantucket. And now we've got Captain Driver on his regular stop at Tahiti. And of course, on all these trips that he's made around the world, the picture on the right, he's carried that large American flag, 10 foot by 17 feet, which they gave to him, the ladies gave to him from Salem, to carry on his ship. So Old Glory is involved in history here. Here's another big event that they're going to be involved with. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, the 65 mutineers, they didn't fit in at all now. It was many years later. They were not welcome at all. They were actually stranded at Tahiti in 1830. They were not welcome because they've actually, that generation, whatever, has lived on Pitcairn Island. They haven't come back for 42 years. It's a whole new generation. They have different cultures. They have different customs. They just didn't. They were incredibly unhappy, and they were targeted by all the original folks on Pitcairn, Tahiti, and that's one of their houses, typical houses that they had, huts that they had. So we'll go to the next slide. And here's where Captain Driver comes involved. He was docked at Tahiti. And they were totally desperate. So they pooled all their resources together, went to Captain Driver from Salem, Massachusetts, and said, look, we know this is out of your way. Can you take us 1,000 miles from Tahiti to Pitcairn? That's our original homeland, and that's where we want to settle. And he took a look at their situation, and he said, okay, so under the flag of Old Glory, he went out of his way. All 65 of the descendants of the mutiny on the Bounty, the mutineers, got on a ship, the Charles Doggett, and they sailed from Tahiti to Pitcairn Island in 1831. And William Driver said, you know, his ship and his flag, of course, were so important to him, and he just absolutely loved them. And he made this statement. He said, God has saved my ship for this purpose. And he really believed that. He said, something happened, my ship happened to be here, we happened to be able to save all of these people. And it was amazing. I mean, the world just sort of said, wow. I mean, it was just a major story that Old Glory and the captain and his ship saved all these 65 people. So we'll go to the next slide. And to this day, Pitcairn Island remembers the HMS Bounty. Of course, that was sunk there. And they put together all these different stamps depicting the different stages. You can see on the lower right, there's John Adams, who kept all the people going there. He actually changed his ways there many years ago for survival. He had the original Bible from the Bounty, and he got gathered together, and he taught all those folks there Christianity. And that's one of the reasons why they couldn't get along in Tahiti. They had a whole different culture, but because he did that before he died, they all had, were very well grounded, if you will. So we'll go to the next slide. And to this day, some of the Bounty artifacts, there's on the right, there's a cannon of the Bounty that they salvaged on Pitcairn Island. And on the left, they have all these things. The only thing left of the Bounty, of course, all the wood is long disintegrated, is all these iron objects, almost like a brick size. Those are all iron, and they were the ballasts on the Bounty. And those are covered on the floor where the Bounty was set on fire and where it was just went right down into the bay. And we'll go to the next slide. So this is, if you want to, this was quite a New England story. In history, it was very, I mean, this was the thing to talk about back then in the, certainly in 1808 and then in 1830. You got Captain Folger from Nantucket. He discovered Pitcairn Island in 1808. He finds the last surviving mutineer, John Adams, and he convinces the British Admiralty to spare the last Bounty survivor. So New England will have a piece of history right here related to the mutiny on the Bounty. We'll go to the next to the last slide here, okay. And we have Captain William Driver from Salem. Many years later, the ship Charles Doggett, carrying Old Glory, he rescued all 65 of the Bounty descendants from this island here. It's a great picture of the island. And folks still live on this island. Probably 80 to 100 still live there to this day. So he kept that civilization and that culture going. And I've got a couple items here on my desk here. This is kind of concludes on part 2. The story is going to continue, of course. The first thing right here, we'll go to the book right here, Mutiny on the Bounty, this book here. 2 years later, after Captain Bligh was made it back to England and they cleared him in the court-martial proceedings, he wrote a book of all his accounts of his entire trip, which was the most incredible naval story to this day, to be able to navigate a small boat like that across for almost 4,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. And this book here is one of the books that's every year it gets reprinted. All the way back since 1790, it kept on reprinting it. More people have this book reprinted every year than any other book that was written by William Bligh. Excellent book. This one here is the movie, 1962 came out, Mutiny on the Bounty. Of all the Bounty movies, this one here is the most factual, if you will, and beautifully done with Marlon Brando and Trevor Howard, Richard Harris. You can get this, certainly pick it up at Amazon.com, or you can get it on your TV and your Comcast. It looks as good today as it ever did back there, and it tells the whole story there, and that's and very vivid color, and the acting is tremendous. It was up for many Academy Awards in that particular year. So once again, that's the story of the Mutiny on the Bounty, but we're going to continue with episode 3. More to tell you about on this story of Old Glory. Have a good evening.